Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Jeff,
John, how are you?
very good, mate. We
Bit of a role
unfortunately
reversal now.
we find ourselves in opposite ends of the planet, but it's always good to chat with you. Um, Today we thought we would talk about the topic of peaking, um, relating to sports performance. And the reason that I wanted to bring this up is for some people they may have seen, they may not have. The other day I was slightly inspired to write a blog on peaking because, as most people would know, I'm over in Europe at the moment. You're home in Melbourne, and I'm over here with a couple of athletes competing across a series of competitions, some of which are still in contention for Olympic selection. And on the weekend, we had a competition in the Italian Alps in a place called Sestriere, and the results were extremely positive. We had some big lifetime personal bests from a few athletes. Now, one of the major reasons for that, and it's one of the reasons why we chose to go to that competition, was heavily associated with the fact that the thinner air altitude means the performances can be faster. And it's been well known for a long time. And this meet one of the reasons that I chose this meet actually is because it's had a history of really good performances. Um,
Hmm.
and this is the first year that they ran an international competition again after about 20 or 30 years of kind of a hiatus. Um, and so as soon as I saw it was on the calendar, I thought, yeah, we're going there for sure because I think there's going to be
Hmm.
some good performances to be had. Um, I say this, but shout out to the organisers, particularly Sylvia, who was organising the meet. It was a fantastic meet. It's the best meet we've been to in Italy. Italy, unfortunately for Italians, and as most people know, my background's Italian, they're not good at organising things, that's for sure. Um, but Sylvia did an amazing job, so well done to her and her team. Uh, the competition went really well, as I said, so we had some really good performances. And I started thinking about it on Sunday morning, the day after the competition. We were waiting to do a few things, and I woke up early and I was, writing on my computer, and I thought, this idea of peaking where, you as the coach or the sports performance person or the person involved in the preparation of the athlete often gets confused by this notion of having total control over when the best performances come out. And I will be very open and say I don't feel like I have that level of control. And maybe I'm not good at being able to manage those things, and I'm willing to accept that wholeheartedly. But I just don't see it. I just don't have the philosophy that peaking is about these big manipulations of people's, volume and intensity, and we've planned it down to the minutiae of the minute that they're going to be ready for it.
Hmm.
And the reason that I say that is, we had these lifetime best performances, and we went in thinking that that was possible. And the reason that I don't see it that way is, there's many layers to it, and we'll discuss each of them. But one of the key things that to me makes it seem like, you don't have control is our travel schedule was really bunched up. Right? We got in, what is it? Well, today, that was on Sunday, as I said. Sorry, that competition was on Saturday. Um, we actually arrived 8 days before that. We'd had a competition 4 days before that. And one of the athletes who ran significant personal bests was having such issues with jet lag. She was averaging probably 3 or 4 hours sleep a night, right? And, she was quite concerned, thinking, like, I'm in trouble here. Like, I'm definitely not in an optimal position to run a personal best or to run well, even though she'd actually run a personal best in the first competition that we did. And not only, we flew to Milan initially, and then 3 days later we went to Oslo. So, it was a 6 hour travel day as well. Then
Hmm.
we flew back to Milan, which is again was another 6 hour travel day when you add in travel to the airport, getting to the, to Milan, waiting in the airport, getting back to your accommodation. And then going from there, we had to drive to Sestriere, which was about a 4 hour drive in the car.
Hmm.
So we've had all of this travel, we've had, no sleep and then bang, performances, at a really high level. And the conditions, they were good. They set the track up to have tailwinds and its altitude, but it was cold as well.
Hmm.
They've had unseasonably cold weather in this region. Um, so it was only about, the sun was out, which was nice, but it was only about 14 or 15 degrees.
Hmm.
So as soon as the sun went behind a cloud, it was really
Yeah, you
quite
felt it.
cold.
Yeah.
And it just made me think, it's really not this magical idea of like, I've orchestrated this to this level of so much
Hmm.
control, because it just doesn't feel like that. And I know that you and I have spoken about this a fair bit, but to me, it's, and it has been for a long time, and I'll explain why, that peaking performance is really about making sure that you have the major KPIs or key performance indicators, or if we're going to use the vernacular that you and I have used quite a bit related to complex systems, you have the key modulators of that system functioning at a high level, and in sprint performance, there really is only three, and I'll talk about this in the blog, but we can talk about it in more depth. There's really only three key areas that need to be, functioning at a high level. What factors influence that can be, more like a multitude of things. But the three key factors is, do you have an effective acceleration? I.e., can you get from zero to a really high
To you
efficient top
max
speed?
speed. Yeah, yeah.
When you've reached your maximal velocity, can you um, create high levels of forces in a coordinated fashion to, attain a really, really high max velocity, very fast landing velocities, very, fast ground contacts, very elastic in the way that you cover the ground. And then the third thing is, can you maintain that maximal velocity that you've created? If you can,
Hmm.
if you've got those three balls up in the air and you can juggle them and they can stay moving nice and quick, then you've got all of the features that you need. The thing
Hmm.
that brings the best performances out is not this magical manipulation of, say, their training loads, um, uh, or even the magnitude of their training. It really is just you putting them into a competition where, yes, you need to make sure that they're not so fatigued that they can't actually maximize on those key performance indicators. But really, it's the external factors. It's, the weather conditions. As we speak about all the time, and things like, for instance, the wind, yeah,
Hmm.
all those kind of things. It's related to the fact. But one of the key ones is like, what kind of competition is it? Is it a competition that brings up the arousal of the athlete? Even if they're in really excellent shape, it's often very difficult for them to perform at a high level if they're running against, people that are a much lower level, or even sometimes a much higher level. You kind of want people that are around your level. Um, so it, in many essences is more to do with, do you have these features, maximized and optimal, at a point where they can contribute because of the external factors, uh, at a high level. And I know that, jump in whenever you're ready.
Yeah,
I know,
yeah.
I know that
Well,
you mentioned, like, before we were talking, like this idea of people talk about the quadrennial of
yeah, yeah.
Olympic cycles. And I thought you brought up a really interesting point. Did you want to?
Oh, yeah. Well, look, I think particularly for athletes who have reached the peak of their performance, and they base their cycles around Olympic cycles because they know or feel confident they're going to get to another Olympics, is the idea that if in 2023 you're performing badly, and to say, well, you know what? Doesn't really matter. I mean, like 2024 is the year for us to reach our peak. That's what we're working towards. That is probably about the most naive and ignorant thing I imagine you could think as a athlete or as a coach, because ultimately the performance that you have from session to session, from competition to competition, is not so much about going, oh well, here's the end goal in 1, 2, 3 years time. I'm not saying that you don't think about it, you definitely do, but you don't use that as an excuse to go, well, this performance today doesn't really matter because this isn't really part of the bigger picture. I mean, it should be quite the opposite of like, hang on a second, based on where you are physically, based on what I know you're able to perform, based on where you need to get, you're way off the mark. Like this is don't use next year as the year for you to peak as an excuse. It needs to happen now. But
I, thi-
the
but
well, go on, John.
no, I was just going to say, I'll let you finish, but I think only time you can think like that is exactly what you said, where you know that people are, and I'll tell a story I think I've brought up before, but when you know that you're basically Olympic gold medal favorite, if it's in sport, you're a
Yeah,
premiership
sure.
favorite, and you can actually afford to stay in, say, a higher, load of training. But for most people, they don't have that luxury. So you've got to use your opportunities to maximize your performance throughout the year. Yeah, finish what you were saying, Jack.
Well, actually, and these are probably a few things that we can explore because I know you've even had some experience with some of your older athletes before of they don't actually reach the level they're capable of until the competition is at a certain expectation or level. But the other thing I think about too with this example is when you think about different variables or constraints associated with performance of that hierarchy. Because the way I look at it is, I guess you're doing the things to make sure that they have the right physical attributes and tools to be able to perform what they need to do. And like going back to this, the basic physics of can you accelerate to this certain speed by this point of the race? Can you maintain that? Um, and then there's environmental factors, like you said. And again, they're out of your control. Some of them were in your favor, like you said, or some were in the athlete's favor. Some of them weren't on that day. Then I think about the psychology, I guess, too, because ultimately are you able to achieve a high level when you need to? And it's an
Mm,
interesting example because the reality is there are certain factors that would make you think otherwise. There's been a lot of travel, there's a change in time zone, a lot of fatigue due to disrupted sleep patterns, and these are all things that can affect both our physical and our psychological state. Yet there's probably, I guess, something to be said about just an individual's personality traits and their ability to overcome certain constraints to actually perform when it's necessary.
I think that that's huge, and I think that that's a key factor. Like I spoke to one of the athletes about it because she said, "Oh, I read the blog," and she goes, "Oh, I thought it was interesting." And I said, "There's a common occurrence that we see with junior athletes where they go to, and you've been involved in this. You've seen the schools competition that we're involved in doing some of the physio for. Um, but it's both that, and then you see they have a competition, say, called the All School Nationals, and then the junior nationals as well. And 95% of the kids run personal best nearly, and you think, well,
Mm.
okay, well, those coaches are all experts at peaking. But it's not the case.
Yeah.
It's just that they go
Mm.
there and they're so excited and they enjoy the competitive environment, and because typically they haven't been exposed to as much, they have scope for improvement. Um,
Mm.
and we're sort of laughing about it, yeah, like, oh, yeah, all the junior coaches are much better at picking than the senior coaches. And it's really not, I would say it's probably not the case, even though I'm sure lots of them do exceptionally good jobs of trying to target those competitions. But it's just those kids are so excited that they can get those performances out. And similarly, I found like last year, for instance, one of the athletes, um, who some of our listeners would know, Mia Gross, who works with us as well, doing some of our content. Um, She last year came to Europe with the idea of, okay, she'd come off with quite a significant injury season. She'd had a stress reaction, back. She then had a hamstring strain. Um, and so it wasn't a great lead in. And we trained for about 8 weeks and then we started competing. And she was very nervous about having to do lots of competitions. And one of the things that was interesting is I said to her, and this was last year, this trip is about you learning to navigate competition throughout a very competitive European season and actually accepting I'm spending a lot of money to come here. I
Mm.
need to actually get some results out of this. And I need to
Mm.
actually consistently turn up and finish these races and do well. And I think not that it's related to peak performance, but it was a really, really big turning point for her where she said, okay, well, I'm not going to come all the way to Europe to not race. So I've got to find a way to actually complete these races. And there was only one race that she didn't do, but she ended up doing with individual rounds. She ended up doing 13 rounds of races across a 5 week period, which is probably at least double what she would normally do. Um, so she ended up doing 13 out of 14 race opportunities. And then after that, she was like, not that she feels invincible because she's not, but she felt much more confident about the fact of like, oh, I can
Mm,
compete a lot more regularly than I thought I could. And I can
mm.
do it off travel and sleep deprivation and, you know, trains and buses and planes. And so it completely changed the whole narrative. And exactly what you're saying of like the psychology of it now for her has become one of like, oh, I can find and I can get a result and I can turn up and I can get the job done, even if it's not
Yeah.
perfect in terms of performance. And that's been a complete game changer because it strips away those ideas that people have about like the only time I'll do well is if everything is perfect and
Well,
it's perfectly planned out and it all comes and it's just not true.
you know what this makes me think of, John? We spoke about this recently with talking about you actually having just to train hard and continue to actually push your capacity and sort of use that as a key principle for how you adapt. And it makes me think about maybe there's a similar analogy we can draw of like, when they talk about if you want something done, give it to the busiest person, right?
Yes,
And, that the person who has a lot on their plate and doesn't have time to think about, oh, is that perfect? Or like, oh, but I didn't get enough sleep last night. It's like I've got to get it done. I've got to get up. I've got to do A, B, and C before the end of the day, and then I've got to go and do this and that. And I wonder if there's maybe a similar metaphor we can use for performance too. Of for people who actually just have a lot on their plate, whether it's related to competing and actually having a high competing demand, or maybe even you could draw parallels as to the person who actually is an elite athlete but also works full time and I don't know has kids or whatever it is, and actually is much more um, productive with the time they have and doesn't actually ruminate or get fixated on things of like, oh no, but things aren't perfect because I didn't sleep well or whatever it is. If whether there's something of real value to that.
totally. And as I said, I think this builds into that psychological component that you've mentioned a couple of times.
Mm,
Um, that if you have those are part of the skill set that you need as well. Because if you don't have that ability to say, oh, it doesn't really phase me that these things aren't perfect, or I have been really busy, or I do have lots of things to do, but I need to get a result anyway, and I've built
mm,
up the features that I need in terms of my training. So like I'm here today, the conditions are good to do so. Like let's get a result.
mm,
And I want to shift course just slightly because I want to explain why I ended up down this path a little bit. Um, because initially, like all coaches, you go through this process of kind of learning about the different periodization models. And typically, and it's probably something we can talk about because it's something that when you first start learning as a coach, you start looking, okay, like how do I structure my training that I implement? Am I just going to randomly throw things at people? Do I need to structure it in a particular way? How am I going to construct those cycles of training? Over what period am I going to do that? Do I do a yearly program that or plan that comes down into, they talk about different cycles, microcycle, usually a week or 10 days, then a mesocycle, which might be a month or a couple of months, and then um, having like a macro cycle, which might be, a 6 month or a 12-month period or whatever it is if you're working, say, across a season for team sports um, and it's really interesting because when you start looking into the background of that, you realize that the literature on it is much more about description than it is actually about implementation of any testing of, say, scientific theory. And
mm,
for those people who are aware, you've got people like this stuff started to become documented by Matt Viet in the late 50s. And what he was doing is he actually went around and documented what most of the Soviet coaches and athletes were doing. He wasn't testing anything. He literally was just
mm.
documenting it,
Just observational. Yeah, yeah.
which is important because it obviously
Of
is
course.
giving you an idea of what they did. But that then became the foundation for how most people actually implemented training. And the way that they
Mm,
implemented their training was very much these big waves and cycles of high volume and lower intensity, and then an
Mm.
increase in intensity and a reduction in volume over time. And whilst on at a simple level that makes perfect sense, it's not the only way that you can do it. And then we started to see different models start to be implemented. People like the description of, vitamin Ether and stuff in block periodization, where you do blocks of intensification of certain parameter. So you might not do
Mm.
every sort of KPI, you just do one or two, but you do it really intensely and then you move to the next one. And you would do them sort of in a step phase manner where you sort of go, I'm going to develop, say, strength, and then I'm going to develop power, and then I'm going to develop speed. Right? And you might really intensely introduce those. And then we started to see models on top of that start to be created in what that people call vertical integration, where all of the features are being trained, but they're done in different proportions. And what we've described as people like we've spoken about a lot, someone like Anatoly Bondarchuk implemented, this idea of a complex training system where all
Mm.
features are being trained. And he was so um, strict on the KPIs, is he would train all of those features within the same training session, not even across like a training period or say a microcycle. He would say like, if for instance he was coaching sprints, he would coach the acceleration, the max velocity, and the velocity maintenance all within the same session. For him, he was a
Mm.
throws coach, a hammer throw coach in particular, but he would do all the features that were needed for that. And if you needed to separate it, which sometimes he did, he would do it across a couple of sessions. But typically, he would try and get most of the features done. So the way that they structure their sessions is really interesting. They're usually pretty short, but he would often have them train twice a day, and he would do the most important thing being throws. He would do that first. Then he would do activities that support the throws, maybe like heavier implement throws. To say, the hammer for the men is 16 pounds or 7.26 kilograms, and then he might throw, if it's early in the season and he wants to do something that's developing more strength, he might throw a 9 kilo hammer for a few throws as well. Then they would go and do, um, some, like Olympic lifts or plyometrics, and then they would, go and do some general strength stuff, and then they would do some general preparatory items. It might be like flexibility work, or it might be some core
Mm.
training or whatever it is, which to me is really interesting because it's a way of integrating all of those features.
Mm.
And this is a very long story of basically saying, when I realized this, I was like, okay, there's really not one way to do this. You can structure your training session, you can structure your program in a very, very, very different way. What is the key feature? And what the key feature became was something that we've discussed a lot, which is, are you optimizing the capabilities of that complex system? And much of this discussion, for the people who want to get into the weeds a little bit, I would refer you to start reading some of John Kiley's work, Kiely. He started writing some things probably in around 2007, 2008 that were really questioning, okay, where is the structure of periodization and what is the literature and is it actually robust and is it not? And he starts to put in the question, and I remember reading it and going, oh no, like, I, I don't understand anything anymore. And if you're early on in your understanding of, say, sports performance programming, I would really encourage you to read it because it will push you. It will ask you to ask yourself some questions that maybe you haven't thought of yet. And it can get difficult because at times you think, okay, this is too esoteric. Like I need some substance, I need some structure.
Mm.
And, we've spoken about some of his work before, but one of the things that eventually it came to was, for us, it's always been about understanding, how do I get this individual from here to here? And, we've spoken about it a lot, that the only way to really shift, well, there's a couple of ways to shift a complex system in terms of how you structure it, but the main one is you have to apply stress to that system. And so you've got to think, okay, what's the current capability of that modulator or KPI? So their ability to accelerate, and there's lots of features in there. Are they coordinated? Are they powerful? to understand the movement, have it tested and all those things. And you've got to work out, okay, how do I apply training so that it goes from their acceleration capabilities here to here? Um,
Mm.
and that's really the key feature that you need to be thinking about. And so what you're really trying to do is just elevate these levels of each of these modulators to the point where, okay, that system has the ability of getting that, what we call modes of behavior, accelerate quickly, consistently, and do it in different conditions.
Yeah, the thing I think of, John, too, as you talk about this concept of periodization, is there's the argument to be made about different models. But the other thing I think of, in using the example, say, of your athletes, is timelines actually too. Because, and this sort of goes into thinking about how good are we at predicting human behavior and outcomes in the future? And it seems to me that our ability is actually pretty limited in reality. And obviously, the further you go out, the much less clear it is about someone's ability to perform in 6, 12 months' time.
Yeah,
So I've got
yeah,
a little cat frame. um, but, and so that's the thing I think about straight away is the timeline. And the other thing that makes me think of then too, John, is how that influences the kind of training that you do. Because it seems to me that there is a bit of a risk that you take if you really refine and focus only on one part um, of your training within a particular, micro meso cycle of 2-4 weeks. Because the reality is, if you're only focusing on one particular thing with the idea of, oh, well, then in the next cycle, I'm going to focus on this, and next cycle, I'm going to focus on this, you're putting a lot of risk on what happens between now and then, as opposed to the idea of like a more complex training model where you're actually continually watching multiple things. You may be focusing on one or two things that you think is more important, but you actually are continually getting feedback, which to me, like at least I guess it feels more, you're able to make more better real-time decisions, because I feel like the more that we try to plan in the future, the less we are at being able to predict where that person is at that point in time. And that's obviously important when you think about, oh shit, actually they've lost A, B, and C, which are really important modulators to their performance.
totally. And I think that to me was, and like I said, from a position of, like trying it and feeling exactly what you mentioned, like that disastrous feeling of like, they actually have lost that level of performance across these features. Um,
Mm.
and the biggest
And what
thing,
that does, not just from a performance standpoint, but also an injury standpoint too, I think.
totally, and I
Yeah.
think that's one of the key features that sort of shifted me more towards this complex model. And I want to talk about the other
Mm.
the other thing that caused me to think about using more of this kind of complex model. I won't say that you can't use these other models, and get really good results. It's not actually one is better than the other. It has to be
Yeah. Yeah.
specific to that individual. And I think we made the point before, and I think this is the relevant thing. If you know that you're basically in the medals of the Olympics and qualifying is not difficult, and your level of performance is so high that you can win most of, say, your domestic races, or for instance, if you're a football team, like, if you know you're going to probably play in the grand final, you know that when you play some of the teams that are going to bring down the bottom, you're going to beat them, even if you're in heavy
Mm.
training, even if you haven't necessarily
Mm.
got some of your best players in. You just have a better team. You have a better structure. Um, uh, you're actually a better performing unit. You know that you can take, not that they're calculated risks, right? Risks
Mm.
we talk
Mm.
about safety. You can go into that competition or that game a little bit heavier in terms of training because the level of performance is still there for you to get the result that you're after. And you can maybe play with those ideas of undulating the volume and intensity of your training. But the thing is, what I found for all of the athletes that I deal with, we don't have that luxury. They're not that far ahead of the pack. So they
Mm.
actually need to perform at a really high level, really consistently. And the way the competition structure is now, there's lots of really important competitions. There's not one or two a year. There's 6 or 7 or 8 that really are important, especially if you're trying to qualify for something. Like if you can't, the way it works now, for those who aren't aware, you can run, say for the Olympics, if you're in track and field, there's two ways to qualify. The first one is to run the outright qualifying performance, or throws or jumps, there's a particular distance or whatever it is. But they've made that really difficult. And the reason is because they're trying to
Mm.
encourage people to do more competitions. They don't want people to just turn up and
Mm.
do one comp
Yeah,
and
yeah.
go bang. Then they're not actually promoting sport. They're not building on those things.
No,
They want people to
never
compete
thought of that.
properly. So what they've done is they've created a really difficult performance to actually do that one off. The other way to qualify is to be ranked, it's based on your world ranking. And the way that you get world ranking points is to run a performance, but you also get bonus points for the
Mm.
level of competition you do. So our national championships is worth more points than a local competition, obviously. That is the bonus points, even if the performance is exactly the same. The point score you get
Yep.
for the performance will be similar, but then you get extra bonus points because you did it at the national championship final, for instance. And for that reason, the the qualifying and ranking performances are actually based off your top 5 performances. So you've got at least 5 competitions that you need to do pretty well
Mm.
in, right? At least
Mm.
5. And then you obviously, if you have made it, then you've got the national, or sorry, the major competition, whether that's the World Championships or the Olympics or whatever. So at a minimum, you're probably looking at 6 competitions that you want to be performing pretty well at. And the thing that you have to consider then is which periodization model is actually going to allow you to potentially do that, because
Yeah, yeah.
it's not going to be the classical ones. It's not going to be the single, peak for the season, what they call, like a single peak. It's not even probably going to be a double peak. Um,
Well, to be fair, John, I actually think of like you talk about say team sports and high teams that are good, knowing that they can go into certain weekends playing at a sub optimal level. But for most teams, actually, it's a very similar thing where it's like we need to win every weekend.
exactly. And that's the thing that
So,
has made really changed the way that I thought about it, because when,
mm,
I've been very, very fortunate to have had some athletes come along that are at the level that they can make teams. Um,
mm,
and when you realize that, you're like, okay, well, how am I actually going to attack this for them? Because if they were lucky enough to just be able to run the qualifier every single time they step on the track, then we can have a
yeah,
double peak season. One where we go, okay, we're going to go bang and win nationals and win the qualifier, and then the second one, we'll just go straight to the Olympics and then try and do another peak there. But that
mm,
doesn't work if you're someone who's scraping every performance out to try and
mm,
navigate your way into the world rankings, which for most
mm,
athletes is the reality. It's a very small percentage that just are able to do it straight away. It's probably I don't know, 20% of the athletes in Australia, for instance, can do that. And if you're in that group, then
mm,
yeah, you can go bang and you can worry about things later. But for the majority of people, it just doesn't work like that. And even for those athletes, the thing that's different now is in order for those athletes to make a living, because those ones who are that good, they're on the major circuit, they need to perform at a high level most of the year anyway, because if they don't make any money. So
mm,
even then, this idea of having these big oscillations in training and also potentially then oscillations in your actual performance probably means that even though they can easily qualify, they probably need to be close to their personal best to be making money on the circuit. So they can't afford to have big changes in their race performance because they're training, say, volume or intensity or whatever. Because otherwise, they're not actually make a living either. Um, so it's a really interesting game, and because of that, it really shifted the way that I thought about approaching it. It's like you just can't, in any way, afford to be having um, only a couple of performances a year. They're at the that
mm.
optimal level or maximal level. So it really shifted that concept. And what does that mean then? Like, and so I think, this, what we can discuss is kind of like, how do you actually develop those things we spoke about, like what we're kind of trying to do by building up those modulators? I think it really comes down to being able to, one, obviously assess those things at a high level and know, okay, this is what they're currently performing at. And I've got a pretty good understanding of what those features are. And I think in any sport, like I always say this, we do presentations on biomechanics We do presentations on running performance. You obviously do them on flexibility, and I know you're now starting to do them in relation to fascial manipulation. The biggest key thing then in all of those discussions that we always have is like you need to be able to measure things, and you need to know which
mm,
are the important things to measure. Because you can measure everything, but it doesn't give you anything if
mm,
you can't. One, if it doesn't contribute to the performance in any particular way, like it's something that I know you and I discussed a lot with flexibility. As you said, like there's really poor systems in place for assessment of flexibility, you know, and I think it's actually one of the reasons we see a lack of sometimes I think respect for flexibility interventions is that
mm,
there isn't this really clear delineated model of like, okay, this is a key feature that you should have. This is a key feature. This is
mm,
a key feature in terms of your flexibility across different joints or, soft tissue structures. Um, and so for that reason, they go, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. It's like, well, if we had 10 studies or 100 studies that said if you're unable to touch your toes, your likelihood of hamstring injury goes up 50%, it's like people would be measuring that all the time, right? And that
mm,
might be very much be the case, but no one's actually done that study, right? Or they
mm,
haven't done it on a consistent basis. We know that obviously, and we've spoken to these people, for our listeners, go and listen to these discussions, particularly people like David Bem, like they did show in their research that flexibility training does reduce muscle strain injuries.
mm,
It didn't necessarily reduce other injuries like joint injuries, but it definitely influenced muscle strain injuries, right? And then you can go down to the minutiae of, okay, look, touch your toes equals X. But if there was the research on that, I think people would be going, "Oh, flexibility training is really important. It's key. It's a key pillar of what we do." Um,
mm,
and I think the thing that you've got to do, and this is why it's important to know what to measure, is work out what the KPIs are in your activity that you're working on. Like, what are the
mm,
actual important things? Because people get so caught in the weeds of like, oh, we did, you know, and I'll give you this is me getting on my soapbox, but we get people like, oh, this athlete squatted, you know, 3 times their body weight. And it's like, okay, great, but did that actually convert to their acceleration performance? Because if it didn't, it's a waste
mm,
of your time, right?
mm,
Now, it's not to say that, like, and don't get me wrong, my athletes, or not all of them, but some of them squat really heavy, right? Like, it's not to say
mm,
that I don't believe in that training. I'm just saying, like, I'm not telling people because they squatted that that's why they ran fast. Does it contribute? Yes, but only if I can get them to use it for their, say, acceleration. It gives them the strength and power to propel themselves. It's not a feature of like, oh, and the example would be is if it was the squatting power, then more power lifters and weightlifters would be faster than sprinters, but they're not, right? Because you actually need to be able to coordinate it into a movement pattern. Um,
mm.
and that doesn't mean that like those features aren't things that you put a lot of time and effort into. It's just knowing whether you can then make that jump in the association between the two and when to then say that association is no longer as important to us.
Yeah, and I think also too, the reality is there's so many things that you can do. So then it's a matter of prioritizing. Well, what are the key modulators I see associated with optimizing their performance, and too,
And
because
I think
undoubtedly getting stronger probably has some benefit, but well, one, there's probably going to be a window of diminishing returns for that, and two, to begin with, how much do you see a translation of that as they get stronger into their performance?
And really, it's not to pick on getting stronger because, as I said, it's a key feature of it, things that we do. So it's not that I don't believe in it. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
it's very much more to do with the fact that you need to know what the really, really key performance indicators are. And in
Mm,
sprinting, as I said to you, there's three. Now, they're made up of lots of features, and strength and
mm,
power is one of them that influences, say, acceleration performance exceptionally significantly. But it's working what those features are. And for some things, there's one or two or three or four or five different features that influence that. And the big thing is what you tend to find, when we talk about complex systems, we often talk about this idea of emergent behavior. Then that's the behavior that comes out of that system when you put it in a situation where it's performing at that level. And the thing that you tend to find is if those key modulators are functioning at a high level, then the emergent behavior or the emergent pattern that comes out is generally closer to the anaerobic activity. If they're not,
Mm.
then you may get very like variable performance. And typically it's you have to go back and reassess those things. And sometimes it takes some time to work out what those key performance indicators are. And that's why it's always
Mm.
valuable to talk to people with more experience than yourself in those areas. But you have to be really analytical about it. What were you
I
going
was
to
going
say?
to say, well, going back to where this conversation started with some of the performance of your athletes on the weekend, it shows you how much of a key modulator is related to psychological mindset. Because, and it's not to suggest that things like, for instance, fatigue or sleep deprivation aren't have a negative impact. They clearly do, and probably more cumulative over time. But your ability to overcome some of these maybe even like things that could distract a lot of people from being able to perform well is such an important element that I think gets underappreciated or
Well,
overlooked.
it's funny, the one of the athlete that was struggling with sleep, her partner is actually traveling with as well because he's a hurdler, and he actually made a really good point, which is, you know, you can fake arousal and stimulation, but you can't fake 8 week training block of training every day.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's a really, really valid point of like, you can drink some caffeine, through a coffee or
Mm.
whatever, and if you're a bit tired, like it'll get you up, and you can get yourself excited with some, deep breathing and all that kind of thing. But you can't really fake doing a really consistent training block that really improves these key modulators. And it's just a
Yes.
relevant point. And I think that that's the key thing, as I said, like you can sometimes find ways around it if it is a smaller feature. And this is the point is
Mm.
the key modulators, you can't afford for them to be not functioning at a high level if you want, peak performance. You can afford for some of the smaller modulators to not be optimal. And one of them might be like
Mm.
your current level of fatigue, or sleep or whatever, because now, and maybe we should get on this soapbox because it's something that drives me bananas, is now that everyone's measuring everything, and we spoke about this when we chatted
Mm.
with Tom
Yeah,
Templeton,
yeah.
recovery has become something that people can measure and measure a lot. And it's really starting to piss me off because I feel like people are recovering from nothing. Um,
Well, it literally goes back to the point you made about the other athlete saying you can't 8 weeks of training is not something that and that is the underpinning factor is what I'm trying to say,
yeah,
is the idea of recovery does not supersede the preparation.
yes. And
And
uh,
it's a very important to make sure people understand that hierarchy.
I think that's the key thing, like, and then that's a key feature that I think if you're able to um, get the understanding of the key things that influence the performance of your athletes, then what you're going to do is have a much better probability, a much higher probability of the emergence being closer to their peak performance. And since it's ultimately
Mm,
going to influence that, is clearly going to be, some of those external factors you spoke about. What's the level
mm,
of
mm,
competition? Are they excited by it psychologically? Are the weather conditions good? The wind, all those kind of things. They're going to be the factors that really influence that.
mm,
Um,
mm,
so one of the things that I think, as I said before, I want to mention and get on is like, how do you build those things? We said, let's measure them, work out what they are, and then you've got to start structuring your training around making sure that each of those features is being trained at least enough for you to see growth in those features, right? And like you obviously have to measure as you go through training, and they can be simple measures, or they can be, quite complicated measures. Doesn't really matter. But if we use the example, say if we say, okay, someone's acceleration um, uh, is not where we think it should be for the performance that they're aiming for. You might do a few measures. You might climb them to 30 or 40 meters, and then to work out whether it's related to their power production. You might do that with some sort of resistance sled to work out how quickly can they do that. You might see a
mm,
small drop off or a big drop off. If you get a really big drop off, you go, well, okay, maybe power is a real issue for them. Like they can do it when they're unweighted, but they can't do it when it's loaded, and then you might go and measure, say, their squat strength and go, okay, well, it's here. And what you have to
Mm.
do is think about how do I lift these features to see which ones are going to influence more. And you make some educated kind of guesses and assumptions about which ones influence. And for example, if you said, okay, the acceleration time to 40 is actually pretty decent, right? But I worked out really quickly. I put a 10 kilo sled on them and the time slowed down enormously, say maybe compared to what you expected or their training partners or whatever it is. You go, okay, that tells me that their power is not great. And then you might go to the gym
Mm.
and measure, okay, what's their power output in relation to, some sort of Olympic lift or a jump squat or even just their squatting strength. And you might go, oh, actually, those features are not that good. And so you implement training to work on those and potentially you're implementing training of doing some of those resisted runs, and then you're measuring what's happening when they do them unresisted. Is it getting faster? Is it staying the same? Is it getting slower? And those are the features you're just slowly building up over time. And obviously, as you get more experience, you work out a bit of an inventory of, tricks that you have in your trick bag to pull out when you see, okay, I see this feature and I know that acceleration is important. So we're always probably going to be working on it. And then what we're
Mm.
going to do is build those things. And in that complex methodology, the idea really is that you're working on all of the key features throughout, typically, say, a mesocycle, sorry, a microcycle. So if you're, most people work in a 7-day microcycle, it just tends to fit better for most people's lives. Now,
Mm.
and that's not to say that you have to use 7 days. You can use 10, you can use 14, you can use 4. It doesn't really matter. All that matters really is that you have the ability to apply stress in some sort of way in which you can measure and know what you're implementing. Um, Typically, 7 works just because people are habitual and we like routines, and particularly people who are studying or working, it's a good way of implementing it. And if you're in a competition schedule, say like team sport, you typically play it each week. So probably
Mm.
best to structure it that way just for the simplicity of it. Some people like changing it because they like making things complicated for themselves and everyone around them. I wouldn't encourage it because it probably is just pissing everybody off. But, if you think it's really valuable, explore it. And if you have people with flexibility, then it's different. I would say definitely experiment for each individual if it's an individual sport. And you need to have, I will say, and this is a caveat, you need to have the ability to manipulate that a little bit because you do see, as we spoke about with changing competition schedules, even in team sports, sometimes they have 5-day turnaround, some days, 8, 9. So if those teams aren't used to that, then it can be an issue as well. So that's something
Mm.
that you need to consider. With that in mind, like I think that the key thing is usually the way I structure it, and this is not the way you have to do it, but the way I structure it is I'm making sure that I'm at least touching each of those key KPIs within at least once through that Microsoft. So for us, and we do, we're on the track more than that, but
Mm.
I'm making sure that I'm at least touching it, one, very much dedicated to acceleration session. There might be something else in there as well. One that's really related to maximal velocity, and one that's related to maximal velocity, but I'm touching that at least once in a microcycle. And I
Mm.
think the same thing could happen, for instance, in a team sport, the same thing could happen, um, in like, I'm no team sport expert, but like if you're a football coach who coaches the same for football, there's some key features that really influence your capability as a team to do well. And I think that they're simple, which, people probably laugh and think, you're making this too easy, but it's like, there's probably 3 parts of the game really, and it's just like, there's midfield transition. So can you, one, get the ball for your team, and can you hold it, and can you transition it from one end of the ground to the other? Then you have the defensive side of the game, and then you have the attacking side of the game. So can you stop
Mm.
people from getting goals? Can you score goals? And can you win the ball when it's up for competition? Right?
Mm.
You could probably have one training session each of those each week and do really well as a football team where you're practicing those features and working on them as a team. Now,
Mm.
people in the NFL are probably laughing at me going like, this guy has no idea. So yeah, I'm happy to cop that criticism if people have it. But to me, it's those are the very key simple things. Are there a million factors that go into defending? Yes. Are there
Mm,
a million factors that go into, you know, the ball being in dispute? Yes. Are there a million factors in you having, the ability to score goals? Yes. But those are the three KPIs. And if you have, in my mind, if I was coaching a football team, even at junior level, I would probably do one of through those things, at least once through the week. And maybe you do it where half the session's one thing and half's another, or you split them off into groups or whatever. But I would be working on those things consistently. Um, and that's the way that I think that if you're doing that, as you mentioned earlier, Jack, like you don't have this fear that it's going to, diminish before you even move to the next phase of training.
mm. Well,
Um,
I think also too, like, if you're not in touch with those other, like, all the different key factors you think associated with performance, it's a bit of a scary prospect to be like, oh, where are they with their, metabolic conditioning or their strength or their speed or their, ball skills if it's a team sport, whatever it is. It's something that I think you feel like you're taking a bit of a risk if you're going too far away from certain key performance indicators.
Now, I will say, and this is something that we have discussed before, if someone reaches a certain level of performance that's high enough, you may need to heavily intensify a particular area, like because we've spoken about stress and how we habituate to
Mm,
that stress and we have that sort of, as I said, like
mm,
topic kind of behavior to if we keep maintaining a certain level of stress magnitude, you may need periods where you need to intensify those things. And the way that you do that is, like some people call it like an undulating system. Um, But really, all you're saying is it's not that you drop those other features off. It's just that you're maybe intensifying on the other ones, like on the one that you want to work on. You can
mm,
do it in what Isserin, describes as being a real block heavy model where you're really working on that one feature because you want to go super deep on that. But I think, as you said, it still risks you having that potential to drop off on some of those other ones. And the way that I get around this generally is I'm always just looking to gradually grow each of the capabilities of each of those features over time. Um, so it's something that I haven't spoken with people a lot about, but I see that when I start training, I want it to be done at a, say, particular intensity that's I think is correlated with the KPI. And then
mm,
with volume, I actually look to increase the volume across a training period. Not like we don't start with more volume at a lower intensity and go, you know, towards higher intensity and lower volume. I actually started with the intensity that I want or pretty close to,
mm,
and I'm
mm,
actually trying to grow the capability of doing that. So say, yeah, as a silly
mm,
example, if you're doing, say, accelerations with sled runs, we did those yesterday, for instance.
mm,
When we started the pre-season with some of the people still back in Melbourne, we would only do, say, six of them. And then after a cycle or two, they'd be doing eight. And then after a cycle or two of that, they might go to 10. And eventually I would like them to get to maybe, say, 12 um, accelerations using the sled. Um,
mm,
now, that is, I think, in contrast to the way some people do it, because they're always thinking, no, no, we'll start with more, but and then we'll slowly work our way down, and the intensity will go up. I try and keep the intensity there, and I try and grow that feature because I want that KPI. So if it's a modulator, it's here. I want it to expand, so it becomes
mm,
much more robust, and it means that if I'm looking at what emergent pattern's going to come out. It's like, well, they're really good at producing a lot of high intensity acceleration performance. So I'm more confident that that's going to come out in the competition. And if I only do a little bit of it, but it's really intense because maybe they haven't had enough practice. And so I'm looking,
mm,
well, if they can do 12 of these or 15 of these, I'm not concerned that one, they're going to fatigue from that performance, but also I'm pretty confident they're practicing enough that they can then implement in a competition setting. And that to me is something that probably has changed. And you've got to do it gradually because each person has a certain training history behind them and you've got to listen and you've got to learn from what's happening around you. But it really gives you the opportunity to expand on those things so that, as you said, Jack, like you can be confident, but it's like, no, well, we started, we could only do it's just metabolic conditioning. Like, you can only do 5 sets of 2-minute runs or something, but now you can actually do 15 sets of 2-minute runs. So we're pretty confident that
Mm,
your, metabolic conditioning in relation to those aerobic runs is better than what it was when we started.
mm,
Rather than going the other way around, which with classical, it's like, oh, we started with 10, but at a lower intensity. Now we only do 5. It's a higher
mm,
intensity, but you're like, oh, well, we're preparing for the marathon. Like, it's like, you should actually be growing that.
mm.
I always think that it's a separate topic, but I always think that's an interesting thing about, say, marathon preparations. A lot of people do that big undulation. They go up to, 35 kilometers or 38 kilometers, and then all of a sudden they drop everything off. And I think, well, maybe that's not the best way to do it. Maybe you should just be consistently growing
Yeah.
throughout.
Do you think that also depends on the maturation of the system, like, i.e., their training history? Like,
Yeah,
is that really more for the experienced athlete with a good training history and has a robust physical capacity?
yeah, totally. And we've spoken about that before.
Mm.
So a lot of, this is the big caveat, and it's good that you brought this up. This is for people who have training history behind them. If you're dealing with a
Yes.
immature athlete, and we say immature, not psychologically or emotionally, we're saying, that hasn't been
No,
exposed to a
no.
lot of training and biologically they're younger, you probably want to sequence things a little bit more. You probably want to use
Yeah.
more of that classic development periodization
Mm,
because
mm,
you're trying to slowly expand things and they don't have the capability of dealing with that much training, stress, and intensity that's closer to, say, the intensity of the activity. Um, but in saying that, though, like, one of the things that works really well in team sports is like just getting the kids to play a lot, which really
yeah, that's
is
true.
very close to the intensity. You just like play the
And
game. They play
totally.
basketball and
Yeah.
they just like, all right, we're just going to play
They're all
basketball.
out.
Yeah, so
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point.
you have to put that in context, and for them, maybe
Mm,
it's not developing some of the underlying features that influence that modulator, but you let them play, and you design the games in ways, talk about constraints-based learning. You design the games in ways that it gives them the opportunity to practice that feature. So maybe it's like they're playing really
mm,
defensive on purpose. You have more
mm,
defenders, or even you have less defenders versus more attackers, and players who are doing the defensive work are really working. But that's the game, and they
mm,
just play and play and play. So I
mm,
think that
mm.
that's the way in which you can kind of get around some of those things. Um, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add, Jack.
No, I think we leave it there, John. That was good.
Perfect. For all of our listeners, we appreciate all of you listening. Make sure that you like and subscribe if you're on our YouTube channel. If you're listening through this through, Apple Podcasts or Spotify, make sure that you subscribe as well so that you can get updates on what we're doing. And also, if you are interested in anything we're doing in the clinic, in relation to, workshops and courses, or any of our education content, head to our website at melbourneathleticdevelopment.com.au.